there was an incident out of Washington, D.C. this week that I just had to share with you. Because you know what? I think it shows so much about how the left really works. Now, to set this up, first, cast your mind back to 2017, the early days of the Trump administration, when the then president got into a fight with reporters, what else is new, over the Maoist attempts of the left to erase American history.
George Washington was a slave owner. Was George Washington a slave owner? So will George Washington now lose his status? Are we going to take down, excuse me, are we going to take down statues to George Washington?
Well, of course, we would never do anything like that. Never. Because at the time, so-called expert historians said that Trump was just being his normal hyperbolic self and that there was absolutely, positively no way Revolutionary General and first President of the United States, George Washington, or any of the other founding fathers, for that matter, might be next on the cancel train. Well, surprise. Not only is George Washington next, but there is now even a push on to rename even Washington, D.C.'s George Washington University. And the latest call for this has just been published in, wait for it, the Washington Post. What? Yeah, I know. Which I suppose must be on the hunt for a new name for itself. May I suggest Pravda on the Potomac? Anywho, the editorial by a student at George Washington, boo hiss, named Caleb Francois, calls for not only Washington's name to be expunged, but those of many other heroes as well. Francois writes, the racist visions of James Madison, Winston Churchill, and others are glorified through building names, programs, statues, and libraries that honor their memory. The controversial Winston Churchill Library must go. The university's contentious colonial moniker must go. Even the university's name, mascot, and motto, Hail Thee, George Washington, Francois writes, must be replaced. Now, the hypocrisy of George Washington in not addressing these issues, he says, is an example of how black voices and black grievances go ignored, and it highlights the importance of strong black leadership. Right. Well, look, a lot of this idiocy speaks for itself, and it's not worth wasting our time defending the naming of a library after Winston Churchill. But it is worth noting that this is what happens time and time again. It's known as the salami strategy, whereby the left starts out with what sounds like a perfectly reasonable demand, oh no, we just don't want to honor slave owners, and gets people who are just trying to be nice to agree with it. And then, inch by inch, slice by slice, they demand more and more. Now, one of the big reasons why Trump was hated so much was because he was onto this, and he called it out, and his prediction about what would happen to George Washington and the efforts of the haters to expunge him from history has, of course, come perfectly true. This is why what are often derided as petty culture war fights are actually so important and worth being had, because it's not just important to look at whatever the demand being made around the current thing is in isolation, but to understand where it is heading next.
President Biden's sister says she thinks Meghan Markle would make a brilliant presidential candidate.
Well, I mean, it just goes to show just that the political nous in the Biden family is genetic. It runs across sibling lines. It runs through that entire family, not just down to Hunter, but also to the sister. I mean, this whole idea that you would, get Meghan Markle as president, it's so laughable as to be a joke, but apparently this is something that the Bidens and all their genius are entertaining. Great. But there do seem to be an awful lot of people who want to be using this conflict in Ukraine as, it looks to me, to create a real conflict directly between the U.S. and Moscow. And you see this being pushed in a lot of the media that's, constantly pushing all of these different stories about the Admiral Makarov ship this week and, the Ghost of Kiev last week. What do you make of that? And I know Macron wants to find an off-ramp, but are you concerned that there are other players in this that want to actually escalate this rather than come to some sort of conclusion that's not great, but is better than, the alternative?
I don't think the Americans, if you're talking about the Americans, have a desire to escalate this conflict. I think what they have a desire to do is to support Ukraine, to prevent Putin from dominating the whole of Ukraine or even any part of Ukraine. But not only for that reason, also because if Putin is successful in Ukraine in any way, then that makes him even more dangerous as long as he stays in the Kremlin and threatens other Eastern European countries, including other NATO countries. So I think it's quite important that happens. I don't agree with people like President Macron who says, let's give Putin a face-saving way out of this and give him a chunk of Ukraine.
The narrative always, every single election, develops at some point towards Labour's going to win this.
Yes.
Good point. That's always the way that it goes. And then there's always sort of the shock, how did that happen? Because, let's be frank about it, so many of the cultural gatekeepers and the people who develop that narrative are of the left, and they believe that conservative governments, centre-right governments, are an anomaly that is to be corrected. So you see that reflected through a lot of the media, and then it just becomes sort of a lazy shorthand for things. Now, the big thing there's two big things that we don't know about. Number one, huge number of undecideds this time, and a large part of that is because Anthony Albanese has presented such a small target strategy that there is literally nothing for Scott Morrison to push back against. That's a huge problem, and it's amazing that he's actually gotten away with this for so long. But Matt, talk to us about Labour, their climate policies. What would that do to mining jobs and the mining economy in mining seats and industrial seats in the Hunter Valley, in Queensland and elsewhere?
Well, James, as I said, when we came to government, we actually got rid of the carbon and mining taxes, both of which were a massive handbrake on the development of our mining sector, our manufacturing sectors. And now at this election, the Labor Party have effectively got the mutant child of the carbon and mining taxes in place. They're calling it something very Orwellian, a safeguard mechanism they're going to introduce, where 215 of our nation's most biggest employers, biggest wealth producers of this nation will be taxed under a new carbon tax. What they will do is each year lower the ceiling in terms of the emissions that those businesses can make, and those businesses will then have to go and buy carbon credits, and of course that is a tax. These businesses include almost all of our mines in our country, not just the coal mines, but our iron ore mines, our gold mines, the nickel mines, the stuff that makes this nation wealth, and the stuff that's going to get us through the times of inflation we're seeing, the threats from China. It also will hit our heavy manufacturing industry, and God, we can't lose that right now. We should be protecting and supporting that, not putting a new tax on it. Because guess what? If the Labor Party gets their way and they introduce this new form of carbon tax, I bet you there won't be a tax put by the CCP on their factories, on their industries, on their mining industry. China's just produced a record amount of coal this last 6 months, but the teals are running around there saying that China's doing an incredible job on carbon emissions. We need some common sense, and that's only coming from the Liberal National Party this election.
So how are you finding the reception in Wentworth, where every other person, it seems, is the head of their own climate fund? What you're saying is absolutely correct about so much of this stuff, but what sort of reception is the message getting in Wentworth?
Well, I'm under no delusion as to the battle I have ahead of me. And part of the reason for that is because, I'm not funded by billionaires. I'm not funded by major business that wants to buy favours of me the way both the major parties are. So, it's a real struggle. I feel almost like a guerrilla insurgent the way I've had to campaign here. But again, starting a movement takes time, and this is what I want to do. I've had a lot of people come up to me and, they stop me in the street. They recognise me. I'm never going to be able to road rage again because of this. And, they're very, very drawn to it. A lot of them are people who are very frustrated traditional Liberal voters who didn't feel they had anywhere to park their vote. Now they actually have somewhere safe to park it. And these are people who are not being conned by so-called independents.
Daly has been a very impressive candidate here in the seat of Fowler, which KK has been parachuted into from Scotland Island. She's moved to the electorate now. She's very keen to make sure everybody knows that she did that. But from Scotland Island on the Hawkesbury, where you need a ferry to get to. Now, the fascinating thing, too, is I think the Keneally campaign is really nervous about this because they've started buying Facebook ads and sending out text messages saying that a vote for Daly, who is an independent, who was, by the way, kicked out of the Liberal Party in 2016, is a vote for Scott Morrison. And they've mocked up these photos of her and Morrison together. And it's gotten so bad now that Daly's people, we broke this in the Daily Telegraph this week, Daly's people have sent a lawyer letter to Christina Keneally ordering her to cease and desist this because they say it's deceptive, misleading, and defamatory.